Hello everyone, my name is Luna Alva and this is my channel Once Upon a Midnight. In this channel you will find new short stories every week, some of them narrated by myself and some others by very special guests. Tonight's story is called Tiny Little Nightmare. Let's begin. They say that if you go down Sunhill Street, you can still hear the echoes of the horrors that happened on that day. They are embedded in the blackened walls, concealed behind the green of the abandoned swings that sway with the wind. For Lucy, however, that day was more than just an urban legend. It was the reason behind her nightmares and a big scar on her right thigh. How could working at a school become a near-deadly experience, you wonder? Well, it was for Lucy and her co-workers. It all started on September 25th, 1985, at noon. Lucy was kneeling down finishing a beautiful painting that would decorate the walls of her classroom to celebrate the coming of autumn while her class was on recess. A loud noise startled her. It sounded like shattering glass followed by a shiver that traveled down her spine. The noise seemed to be coming from the opposite side of the building. She stood up and looked through the little window on the door. Everything seemed fine. Some groups were making their way out to the playground. Others were lining up and getting ready for music class or gym. Sarah, her best friend and peer, waved at her from the hallway, smiling happily. Lucy waved back. Her hand suddenly fell against her hip as she saw little Melody crawling from behind Sarah. The 5-year-old looked nothing like herself. Her usually blue-green eyes were all black. Her hands had deformed into disturbing-looking claws. Just like that, little Melody opened her mouth and sank her fangs into Sarah's neck. Blood sprayed everywhere, staining the kids' raincoats in red. Lucy barely managed to cover her mouth with shaking hands when Bobby, a lovely redhead, moved closer, slowly dragging his feet, leaving traces of blood along the floor. As soon as he stood over Sarah's lifeless body, he joined in, numbing on the teacher's limbs. Lucy backed up, tripping loudly on one of the chairs. She fell to the floor without resistance, banging her shoulder on one of the tables. Biting her lower lip to withstand the pain, she made her way to the back of the classroom, sliding through the floor, her breathing heavy on her chest while trying to fight the tears that wouldn't stop. She had no idea what was happening. It seemed a nightmare. She was terrified. Lucy curled against the wall. Above her head was a big window that led to the backyard. A loud bang on the door made her screech against her hands. The banging became louder until the wooden door started to break. Through the small opening, she could see some of the children. Not the children. The horrible monsters that once were innocent kids trying to make their way through. They had transformed into dark creatures, scratching the door with sharp long nails. As the door started to break, Lucy's survival instinct kicked in. She aimed for one of the chairs and hit the window several times. The glass started to break. She used all her strength and threw the chair. The window broke into several pieces. Some of the small ones exploded, leaving razor blade-like cuts on her bare arms. With a sigh of relief, she aimed at the windowsill. The glass was intact. The beast-like creatures broke the door. Their once cute dresses and shirts covered in flowers and colorful patterns were splattered with scarlet stains. Threads of blood-tainted drool running down their necks. Melody was faster than the others and lunged at her. The pain that came next made Lucy almost lose consciousness. The creature's sharp teeth cut easily through her skin. Her jaw locked around her thigh. Lucy kicked her several times, as hard as she could. Her heel went right into Melody's right eyeball, setting her free. Not knowing where she got the strength to move, Lucy made her way far from the group of beast children and into the back door that led to the hallway. She didn't want to go that way, because it meant she'd have to see Sarah, or what was left of her. But she had to run out of options. Her chances to survive were very slim. Maybe she'd run into another teacher and together they could find a way out. Relying on the strength of her good leg, she aimed for the doorknob and opened the door. Sarah's remains were to her left, so she fixed her eyes on the hallway. The side ahead wasn't any better. The walls were marked with bloody handprints, splashes and puddles of blood. She stepped on some jelly-like substance and slipped, falling on her side. Her face was now covered in the blood and fluids of what was obviously the insides of someone. She didn't stop to figure out who it was. As fast as she could, she stood up and continued running. A few seconds after, the holes became cleaner, almost as if the brutality of such murders hadn't reached that side of the school. She slowed down and looked back. No one was following her anymore. Lucy leaned on the wall and tried to catch her breath. Unfortunately, as she was able to breathe slower, the pain on her leg worsened. She looked at it. The flesh around the open skin was hanging, the dried blood sticking the fabric of her skirt to the loose skin. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement in one of the classrooms. Lucy glimpsed through the open door. More children-like monsters were piled up over another body. The distinctive red shoes and knitted green sweater revealed the identity of the victim. Poor Mrs. Harris stood no chance against those monsters. Lucy held back the tears and made her way through the hall. Her plan was to get to the school's reception and use the phone to call for help. She just had to get there alive. Even though it was barely past noon, it seemed that if the night had fallen in a matter of minutes. It was dark outside, almost as if the windows were covered by a black curtain. Along with the darkness, there was silence, so thick and harsh she could hear the cracking of bones and the ripping of skin as the monsters fed on her friends and co-workers. Lucy realized she was numb. Her mind had stopped racing and was focused on walking. Keep going, she thought. Just keep moving. She was so close. There were hardly 4 meters between her and her destination. It seemed unreal that she was about to survive this living nightmare. However, as she came closer, the noise of footsteps broke the silence. Lucy held her back against the wall and tried to take deep, steady breaths. A shadow slithered around the corner. Something was coming closer. Lucy slid down the wall and sat down, holding on to her knees. She tried to become smaller, be one with the shadows, and hopefully, the monster wouldn't see her. Even if the creature did notice her, the 10-year-old monster boy was too busy dragging the corpse of a male teacher. The boy was obviously not strong enough and gave little snorts in his effort to drag the corpse. Lucy felt sick. She was about to throw up, but forced it down, covering her mouth. She had to resist just a little bit more, and this bad dream would be over. As soon as the boy disappeared in the distance, Lucy kept going. She peeked through the window before making her way into the reception. There were no signs of monsters, not even blood or body parts scattered around. She sighed in relief. Maybe some teachers did find a way to escape. Maybe help was on its way and she just had to wait. Not wanting to take a risk, she took the phone and dialed the emergency number. On the other side of the line, she found silence. Deadly, deafened silence. Outside, the commotion of growls and running feet that started as a quiet rainfall grew in intensity, bringing down a storm of screaming and panting. It almost seemed as if she was the only survivor, and now, their only prey. Lucy moved deep into the reception and towards the principal's office. That was probably the only nearby place she could hide in, though at this point, she was sure her death was coming sooner or later. But she was a fighter. If she were to die, it would be fighting. Lucy entered the office and closed the door. She tried to push the bookshelf closest to the door to block the entrance. It was too heavy. She pushed, the wound on her thigh opening as she used all her strength to make the bookshelf fall. It collapsed by the door right on time. The monsters outside banged against it, one after the other, trying to make their way through. Lucy's legs gave out. She dropped down to the floor, exhausted and in agonizing pain. She thought about her family. She wouldn't be able to say goodbye to them. She looked around and grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil. If her dead body was to be found, at least she'd leave a letter for them. Suddenly, The chaos outside stopped, so abruptly that for a second, she thought she was going deaf. Lucy stood up slowly, holding onto the principal's desk to keep her balance. A tiny light appeared around the doorframe, and the door split in half. She backed up and crawled under the desk. Her hands covered her ears like a little girl thinking her blankets can stop the monsters from harming her. She knew it. That was near. She was already in so much pain, and now she was going to be eaten alive. "Miss," said a deep voice. Lucy opened her eyes and looked up. There was a man standing right in front of her. Almond-like eyes and a big smile decorated his face. All this facial balance broken by a long scar that traced an almost straight line over his nose, from one cheekbone to the other. "Detective AK at your service," he said with a foreign accent and offered her his hand. "This is just a tiny little nightmare. Andiamo," he added as Lucy took his hand. Well guys, this is all for tonight's story. If you would like to know what's gonna happen next, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification button. Don't forget to like this video and follow me on all my social media. Have a good night and sweet dreams.